We are pleased to have, this is one of my favorite topics, not only the grid, but how do we green the grid? John, why don't you kick us off? RMI, you have a deep expertise technically in your team, but also you folks have had a vision of thinking about the grid in a novel way for a long time. What would you sketch out as, let's say, 2 or 3 of the most important things we need to do here in the United States to start, if we're going to have a dramatically greener, by which I mean more decarbonized grid in the next 10 to 15 years? What do we need to do?
Yeah, I would start out by saying interconnection, right? Without question, right now, we have 25% of the total renewables that we need to get to net zero queued up for interconnection in the grid, but we cannot connect them right now. And so we've got a significant challenge that is not so much technological as it is administrative, bureaucratic structures that need to shift, kind of overall from a human perspective in order to accommodate our ambitious goals. So as we think about this challenge, there are multiple ways that we can go at it, right? We need to figure out how to model and better understand the dynamics of a grid that has high penetration renewables. I'm sure John will have some thoughts on that front. Secondly, we absolutely need to think about how we can better prepare the existing grid through automating, through smartening, right? Through using some of the advanced technologies that we have that will allow us to accommodate variable renewables. And then third, we do need to expand transmission capacity interregionally. That's a longer term issue that has all sorts of permitting and siting, kind of elements associated with it. But if we can get those 3 things done, we can expand dramatically and meet the moment for this massive demand that we have for renewables.
Just to unpack that a little bit, and thank you for separating the interconnection issue from the transmission issue. Often it gets conflated. They're related, obviously, but they're different and distinct issues. On interconnection, do we need a sweeping new act of Congress to make significant progress? Or is this something that could be done at the level of, at the regional level? Could we have coalitions of the willing? Is there some way to break the logjam without requiring a grand bargain where Joe Manchin gets to lord it all over us again? What's the prospect here?
Yeah, so interconnection, we do need to improve the modeling and the capabilities, the capacity to analyze. Oftentimes right now we're queuing up individual changes in the grid rather than compiling, kind of the dynamic changes associated with what happens when we put storage alongside new solar generation, alongside additional kind of industrial capacity all at the same time. We should be bundling that and modeling more together as we think about the overall interconnect. I think we do need, some real time frames associated with the urgency here that prevent, what right now is a 3 or 4 year queue and pull it inside, kind of a reasonable time frame, because time is money, right? The fact that we're delaying these projects is costing amazing amounts of money to companies that want to invest here in the United States. And so being able to restrict at the local level to have regulators and regional transmission and ISOs to be able to, kind of force that faster action is a requisite here.
Thank you. Let me turn to Jean. Now, Jean, you're in the Office of Electricity, of course, so this is your bread and butter. You think about this every day. When people talk about transmission, the third of John's conceptual map on what we need to do urgently, a lot of people think we need to have massive new transmission corridors, which would be great. We can build, HVDC cables that crisscross America someday. But your argument, I think, is that that's not the only way forward. There are things we can do that might be incremental, might be using existing rights-of-ways. Can you tell us a little bit about how that would work? Is that just small beer, or could that actually accomplish a lot?
No, terrific question. Thank you very much for that. And let me start off with your last statement there, or last question, which is this small potatoes or is this a big deal? I would say it's not small potatoes. It's not a big deal. It's the only deal. And the only deal is this. If the folks in this room agree that from a reliability, resilience, security standpoint, our 19th century grid needs to be modernized, we need to make massive changes in how we operate that grid, how we plan, how we invest, and how we build it out. But let me suggest this. If you look outside the four walls of this building, you see a massive, massive, massive amount of poles, wires, cans, technologies. Behind that, there's so much smart. And so the only common sense solution is to attack it at every element. So job one is look at what we have in our right here in our own wheelhouse right now. We have existing transmission right away. We have right now better technologies for transmitting clean energy longer distances with less line loss. We have, and more security, and the ability to do so much more. Automation came out from first John's answer. Second John will have even more to add to that. But long story short, why don't we look at the art of the possible for what we can get done right now? And we have existing transmission corridors. We should be doing everything we can to advocate for, to push, and maybe even mandate investment in reconductoring, in getting more throughput at less cost using existing right-of-ways, at the same time that we're fighting the battles, the NIMBY battles over new transmission corridors that are absolutely needed, but aren't going to happen in the near term.
What's the holdup? Is what you say sounds so sensible. If these are off-the-shelf technologies, existing rights of way, is it an incentive problem that somebody's not getting paid, or is it still back to having some permissions and paperwork?
Yeah, let me take the permissions and paperwork and put it in a different frame.
Okay.
We have regulatory processes and deliberative processes and planning processes that move slow, and quite frankly move too slow in today's environment for what we need to accomplish. But the bottom line is they're in place for good reason. So what we need to do is find ways to accelerate and optimize those promises. John mentioned something that I think is incredibly important. These regulatory processes, these deliberative processes, tend to look at things project by project by project. But that's not what the grid is. The grid is a network. And you have to be looking at all the aspects, and not just in a service territory that's this big, but what the impacts are across the whole swath of the grid. So long story short, there are no bad guys here, but it's not as simple as providing an economic incentive. We need a transformation, not just in the way we think about the poles and wires, the hardware, but the way we think about regulating, planning, and investing for that grid.
Now, I may be wrong, but I think there's a once-in-a-decade or so grid planning study or review that's being done at the moment at the DOE, am I right?
That is absolutely right.
What's the timeline on that? Because that sounds like the kind of comprehensive overview that you're talking about.
So I wish I were in the grid deployment office so I could give you the absolute right answer to that, but I can give you the answer that I know that Secretary of Energy is going to like, which is as soon as possible. If there's,
but this year. Is that fair?
Yeah, fair enough.
Okay.
This year, the one thing we keep hearing, and I joke a little bit with the as soon as possible, but the one thing we keep hearing from the Secretary, and it reflects the administration's viewpoint as well, is we just don't have the time to fritter away with the slowness and the deliberativeness of processes that we have today. We need to find ways to accelerate things. That includes studies inside the four walls of the Forrestal building, but also improving our regulatory processes and other processes.
I spoke with one of the authors of the prior study, and I'm thinking maybe 13 years ago, I mean a good number of years ago, over a decade ago, and though it was a very thoughtful study in his view, he said it landed with a thud and nothing ever happened as a result. I think, John, you probably have the historical memory. What can we do to make sure that the new comprehensive study that's coming, which will be superb, actually gets implemented in some way? Maybe the both of you, who wants to jump in on that?
I'll start, and,
Sure.
and we'll let John give a more fulsome academic answer because he's a much smarter man than me. But I think it's a carrot and a stick. So the carrot in this is that there's a once-in-a-generational opportunity right here with money out of the bipartisan infrastructure law, the IRA, other elements of financial incentive to drive down the cost of investment in the changes that are needed on the system. So That study now has a little bit of a financial wind helping it along.
Right.
But the sticks part of it is this. I came here directly from a meeting with the CEOs and associations representing all of the members of the power sector, so investor-owned utilities, municipal utilities, and the rural electric co-ops. And everyone in that room, these are CEO or C-suite level folks, everyone in that room recognizes the tremendous imperative of the need to modernize our grid for reliability's sake. Set everything else aside. Reliability and resilience demands grid modernization. Right. So that's the stick element of it.
You can't have the lights go out again.
Yeah, no, exactly right.
John, quick answer on that?
Yeah, we're a nation that loves carrots. We have lots of rabbits here. I think right now we've got a field full of carrots that have just been planted that are ready to make the industry run. And that's going to be the difference between this and 10 years ago.
Yeah, gotcha. Sure. Okay, so lots of carrots. I'm still a big believer in some sticks as well. So let's see. Let's turn to Josephine. Josephine, thank you for being with us. You have an interesting perspective working at JLL. Obviously, you advise lots of companies. You know lots about how land, buildings, and siting goes on. When you think about grid issues, and now you were telling me before we came on this panel, you're advising offshore wind and other developers as well, presumably for some previous sins, because man, that's a tough business. They're not making a lot of money, and now siting is a big problem. Give me an idea of when you think about permitting and grid interconnection for some of these areas that you're advising on, how do you see the challenges? And put some ray of hope here. How do we get forward on the challenges?
Absolutely, and thanks for the opportunity. Great comments so far. I would have to say that, you know, the grid stability question and, you know, the discussion we're having around renewable penetration is as much of a real estate problem as it is a grid problem. Because, you know, you were saying before the word optimization. We have a demand and supply imbalance that needs and can be optimized through technology. Yeah. And I very much believe that. When we think about as these new projects are, you know, looking for locations to site, whether it's utility scale renewables or even just putting rooftop solar on board, right? We're essentially, you know, helping clients figure out how to optimize that supply and demand for their own load and also to meet their net zero carbon ambitions. So, you know, JLL may not seem like the obvious, you know, stakeholder in this or dog in this fight, but we're very much at the forefront of advising around the feasibility of projects, looking at where those projects can be sited, but then also structuring the deals and negotiating between the various entities who are interested, whether it's the landowners themselves or the regulating bodies, investors, stakeholders who will ultimately use that power. There's a lot of you know, dynamic business models that are available.
And if I'm not mistaken, I think one of the groups you advise is the Department of Defense.
That's true, yes.
Can you tell us a little bit, without revealing any state secrets or commercial secrets?
I would never.
What sorts of things are you involved with when you talk about these issues? Is it microgrids? We heard a little bit from the Assistant Secretary. What are you getting into with them?
So we're supporting the Loans Programs Office through the, you know, identification, underwriting, credit risk analysis of a lot of the new technologies, emerging companies that are, you know, basically trying to help with the clean energy transition. So we support, along with, you know, many other teaming partners, that process, which I think has been very, very ambitious. It's great to see, you know, the DOE really transitioning its role to commercialize and help with the onshoring of investment and make this clean energy transition possible in the US. So a lot of interesting and exciting technologies, everything from EV charging to microgrids. And we talked a little bit before about the concept of virtual power plants. You know, there's a really, there's an exciting foray of technologies and companies that are, you know, ready to help with that transition. And thankfully, DOE is there to help provide some of the subsidy that's needed to get them started.
Thank you for bringing up virtual power plants. Maybe, John, is that an area that you could pick up on a little bit? I know you look after renewables and clean tech, so it must fall within your purview to reflect on this. Can you tell the audience what is a VPP? Because we've heard about VPPA, which is different earlier today, and help us understand what is this concept and how can maybe it play a role in the future?
Yeah, sure. Happy to hit that. So with Schneider, I'm wearing the hat today as one of the largest advisors on corporate renewable energy transactions globally. So Schneider, many people know us for the hardware, the software solutions, et cetera, in everyone's buildings, but we actually also represent between 50 and 60 terawatt hours of renewable electricity demand from many of the largest corporations in the world. So I'm going to go with 55 terawatt hours to make us 1 terawatt hour bigger than the U.S. government in terms of total demand represented. But that's globally. So our customers are really looking for solutions for how do you get more renewable energy. We have many companies that are 100% renewable energy target, right? And they're looking for ways to get there faster and often to get there quicker than policy would drive, right? So these are companies that have said, we're going to go, we're doing it anyway, regardless of what the government has said. And so it's a combination of solutions, including demand-side management, virtual power plants. How do we aggregate load and reduce power in times of highest demand instead of having to build new generation? But then it's also, how do we source from renewable sources whenever possible? And so, transmission's obviously a huge component. To go back to your first question quickly, transmission's a huge bottleneck for sure, both interconnection and transmission. We've got, dozens and dozens of, hundreds of megawatts of power purchase agreements that have been delayed or canceled altogether due to the inability to connect to transmission. So it's a huge problem, but Gene's going to solve it. He told me earlier. So that'll be good. But there's other issues as well, I think, that we need to address. One, within the existing transmission infrastructure, can we expand and create ISOs and RTOs, regional transmission organizations, independent system operators in the Southeast United States, in the West, to give people that choice, that electricity choice on where your power is actually coming from, which in many places in the US is still regulated. Another is actually something I haven't heard mentioned yet, where the greenhouse gas protocol is being looked at from a Scope 2 emissions framework. So market-based versus location-based emissions. And I'm not sure how many in this room are familiar with that, but the ability to claim emission reduction based on your contracting with a market-based scheme is what allows corporates to choose renewable energy and to drive more renewables forward, which is what we've seen since 2015. Nearly half of all the offtake agreements signed in the US have been driven by corporate, not traditional utility offtakers.
And you see that trend continuing?
Oh, absolutely. We've never seen more demand. The supply can be a little bit challenging with some of the interconnect issues, with rising interest rates, with inflation. There's some headwinds, certainly. Some of the solar tariffs, some of the forced labor issues from China, certainly some headwinds, but the tailwinds is both the IRA, which is a huge tailwind and certainty for investment for 10 plus years, for the renewable industry, which is huge, but really the demand. We were very surprised in 2022 with all the headwinds that we had more clients sign renewable energy contracts, long-term additional renewable energy contracts than any year previous within our business in the US, which was shocking with the rising rates and interest rates. It's the demand. The demand is overwhelming everything, which gives us a lot of optimism going forward.
And is it fair to say the reason for that corporate demand is net zero commitments that companies have made? Or is it something else, some other reason?
Yeah, it's often top down. It's shareholder, stakeholder-led, employee-led. Companies want to be good corporate citizens, right? And so there's been a combination of carrots and sticks there. You can avoid a lot of backlash from NGOs, from agencies, if you're putting a good foot forward and being a good corporate citizen, but it's also just good business. So it's net zero commitments, it's RE100 commitments, it's EV100 commitments, right? There's going to be a drastic demand for more renewables into the future.
I would say that it's, I totally agree with all your comments. And I would also say it's not just about being a good corporate citizen. It's not just about a sustainability agenda. It's managing energy security. Yeah. It's managing, your own risk. More than 50% of our clients have set net zero targets that they expect to achieve before 2030, and we hope to help them get there. More than 60% of our investor clients say that by 2030, they expect that they will be producing their own renewable energy on site. Those are big numbers to achieve, and they're not just doing it out of the kindness of their heart.
It's a de-risking exercise to some degree.
Not just de-risking, but also cost, right? We have seen the exponential decreases here in solar, in storage costs here, and increasingly going back to virtual power plants, they're becoming incredibly economic, right? And they're unrecognized resources that currently fall between the cracks in existing resource planning processes that kind of need to be treated at scale. And some of the analysis that RMI has done has shown it's about 60 gigawatts of additional capacity that we can animate in the market here by 2030 from investments that companies, that individuals with their homes and their EVs, et cetera, can be pulled into the grid and used as resources to help manage a high penetration grid here going forward. And that increased flexibility comes at about half the cost of an existing gas plant. So it's quite economic here as we think about the changes that need to happen.
See, BJ, you've officially lost control of this panel.
No, this is
We're
great.
taking over for you. So
I love it. I said it's my favorite topic of the day, so that's great.
Let me play back two words that you heard earlier that I think are incredibly important so that I can be mean to you for a moment.
Please, bring it on.
The first important word was the word optimization that Josephine used. Yeah. Because in real life, nobody looks at an engineering problem and says, I only want to solve this part of it. Mm-hmm. The grid today is not a big generator at the end of a big wire that gets distributed down in one direction. The grid today includes this proliferation of clean energy assets all over the grid edge. And so the real question is the second word. And that is, let's move away from just thinking about the proliferation of these assets and think about how we optimize them or integrate them into the system. Because that's where the value is that RMI is pointing out. Yeah. Right now, we do, as a nation, we do a poor job of making truly fulsome use of grid edge assets. We use them in emergency. State of California, where I grow up and come from, we brag about the fact that when we call for conservation, it's there. But we're not using it in a meaningful way every day, day in and day out, to get better asset utilization. These assets are out there. This is a tremendous opportunity for our country. Everywhere, let me say this last thing.
Yes.
Everywhere you look, folks are really excited about all the potential at the grid edge. I say if we use American ingenuity correctly and put businesses to work, what they're already doing, creating more and more and more potential at the grid edge, we can lead the world in actually making a more efficient, more reliable, more resilient, and better optimized grid that includes more fulsome use of grid edge.
I don't know why you think that's being mean to me. You're singing from my song sheet. I wrote a book called Power to the People that argued for the decentralization, digitization, and decarbonization of the power grid as the future. So I'm with you on this page. I want to know how to do it operationally. And I want to turn to you, John. You've got a partnership that called the Virtual Power Plant Partnership, VP3, I think you call it. Can you tell us, for those of us that want to, who get the concept, maybe even like it, but just want a little more on how to get it done, what are you trying to accomplish? What's the next step, or what are you trying to pull together here?
Yeah, so the Virtual Power Plant Partnership that we have, VP3.io, if you want to go to the website, it was founded by folks like GM and Ford and Google, alongside Sunrun, SolarCity, others, that all came together and said, okay, how do we coordinate this new set of resources that we have? Because they do fall through the cracks, and there isn't a way to incorporate them at scale and integrate them like Gene is suggesting. And so that specific group is focused on, okay, let's do some of the basic footwork around How do we characterize what's possible in terms of potential? How do we start adjusting some of the regulatory asks and requests that accommodate? How do we change some of the planning processes that are needed to incorporate them in at scale? And then most importantly, how do we transact and get them priced into the market, whether it be wholesale, whether it be in specific retail scenarios, so that you can actually get value from these assets that have the ability to provide value to the grid, but right now are sitting dormant on the side for the most part, right? And that is the beauty, is that we can start to optimize the grid, not just from the supply, but from the demand side too, and that's going to lower the cost for everyone in the end.
And make the system much more resilient going forward.
Just imagine if you...
Yeah, I'm going to come to the audience in just a moment, but please go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, to really underscore that point, if you just in practical terms think about every individual who's got a solar, PV on the rooftop or an electric vehicle in their garage, being able to capture the generation and battery storage capacity and also turn on and off those loads in a dynamic way, that collective action has the power to really transform the efficiency and the reliability of our grid. And that's really what we're talking about.
Yeah, and last quick point on that, it's not a technological barrier. Schneider Electric does tons of microgrid hardware, software optimization on the scale within the fence, right? Within critical infrastructure fence. It's not that we can't optimize it. It's if you really want to expand it, if you want to go across utilities, across state lines, really say, let's look at this whole grid together, that's where it becomes much more challenging from a regulatory and political standpoint.
And that's where we need you and allies on the Hill to step in and make it work, right?
We're rolling up our sleeves and pushing that direction as hard as we can.
Yeah. All right. Any questions for our grid panel? Right here in the front row, a quick hand goes up. Let's get a microphone here, please.
Hi, my name is Kay Kaufman. Hi, Gene. And I'm with RTO Insider. I guess this is for Gene and John. Part of the debt ceiling deal, if it goes through, is the call for yet another study on interregional power transfer capability, I guess because the Republicans feel they don't know enough. But in any event, which would take 2.5 years. Do we need one? And I guess particularly, Gene, what can we do in the meantime using what we've got now? Because obviously it's very important for reliability and for getting more renewables on the grid.
So at the risk of making this my last day of being in public service, I will answer that from a personal perspective, if you don't mind. And part one is, absolutely we need to do anything that brings more people to the table to start thinking about what grid modernization means. And it's not changing out just poles and wires. It's about everything to do with how we plan, operate, and invest in our system. Now, does that mean that the time it takes to do a fulsome study should be serial to everything else, so everything else stops and then we wait for that to be done? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. But whatever it takes to get the debt ceiling sword off our heads, let's allow that to happen. Let's move forward in good faith on everything that's asked for. Let's bring more people into the conversation, but let's continue moving forward with what needs to be done to support reliability, resilience, affordability, and security of America's grid.
I think your job is secure.
Thank you.
All right. The gentleman there.
I think this question is more for Gene, and probably John also sideways. But VPP, and is there a special? Because I've not seen the funding for it from the IRA. Maybe I missed it. Because I guess you just came to this job maybe recently. A lot of activities from DOE were going on. So is there a funding, or should we talk to both of you or something?
Yeah, it's a good question. Show me the money.
Show me the money is the right question to ask. I'd ask you to look in two places. Thing number one, look at the Loan Program Office. There's an awful lot of work that's being done out of the LPO, or Loan Program Office, to look at helping to fund more virtual power plants. Number two, I think you just heard the best answer you will ever hear from this side of the panel, which is companies and people are doing it for themselves. I have an EV in my garage. I've got solar on my roof. I've got responsive devices in my house. It's actually out there, whether or not there's a federal funding source or not, but there is massive funding available as well.
Last word, John.
Now, yes, I think we would say the money is certainly there through all the batteries, through all the subsidies that are kind of supporting the existing equipment. We need to get that translated, though, into the exact market incentives that are required in order to have everyone usefully monetize those. And that's where RMI and all of our partners are working in consortium with all those companies I named and more, to try and make that happen.
So we're back to that question of rubber hitting the road, implementation, roll up your sleeves. We thank you, our panel, for giving us a good look in the weeds of how the green grid is going to come. We appreciate it. Thank you so much. I turn the microphone over to my colleague, Carol O'Donnell. Thank you.